All right, well, thanks, Laura, and it's my pleasure to introduce our final speaker, Dr. Melanie Davis. Dr. Davis is an assistant unit leader with the U.S. Geological Survey's Oregon Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit at Oregon State University. Her current research is centered on salmonid species, although it was actually a love for herpetology that jump-started her scientific career. Growing up in central Ohio, Melanie spent much of her free time chasing snakes, salamanders, and frogs around her backyard. Since then, she's had the fortune to study a variety of species and systems, and the common thread that ties her work together is the integration of quantitative methods, landscape scale analysis, and species-habitat relationships. Melanie is passionate about applied ecology and the ways in which it can positively influence management decisions and outcomes. When not staring at our code and hurting her students, she enjoys going for hikes with her family, camping, climbing, and playing board games. Melanie, thanks for joining us today, and we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks for the introduction. So I'm really excited to chat with you all today about some ongoing work in the Nisqually River Delta. This project is really the result of decades of co-management and cooperation among the Nisqually Indian Tribe and the Fish and Wildlife Service and USGS and a ton of other federal, state, nonprofit agencies and groups. So certainly the perspective that I'm presenting is only a tiny slice of what has been going on in this estuary. And of course, I'm coming at it from kind of a scientific perspective. So I have tried to kind of keep things higher level. But what I'm hoping to present to you today, or I'm hoping you'll get from this, the take-home message is kind of this layered structural framework that we use to assess restoration success in the Nisqually Delta. So hopefully the clicker works. Yes. All right. For those of you who aren't familiar, the Nisqually River Delta is located in the southernmost part of Puget Sound, or the Salish Sea. It's located near Olympia, Washington, and it's the site of the largest estuarine restoration project in Puget Sound. And what you can see in this picture is that it's created this lovely complex mosaic of restoring estuarine habitats, historically unaltered estuarine habitats, and then there's also still a freshwater management unit that the Wildlife Refuge manages, and that's you can hopefully see that on that right side of the screen in that kind of newer dike section. The delta is kind of cut off at the southern end due to the I-5 corridor. As I'll talk about a little later, there's limited room for lateral expansion right now, and that highlights the importance of these restoration efforts. And like most, if not all, estuarine restoration projects in the Pacific Northwest, the restoration was carried out for the benefit of juvenile salmon. In particular, the hope was that by restoring this habitat, we would improve Chinook salmon populations so that the Nisqually tribe could continue to fish this critical resource in perpetuity. And thanks to Chris Ellings from the Nisqually tribe for these awesome pictures of some really chunky Chinook salmon. Restoration is, just as I'm sure you're all aware, just a tiny fragment of overall considerations for salmon recovery. The hope is that salmon use restoring habitat and access and benefit from it. So it really does play a critical role in the recovery of these salmon species. Another thing to note is that the Nisqually Delta restoration that I'm presenting to you today is only one piece of the restoration puzzle. In the entire Nisqually watershed, there have been numerous freshwater and riparian restoration projects that have been carried out by the tribe, federal agencies, state agencies. As you can see in the margins, many funding agencies and many people who are supporting this restoration work. So again, this is just a wonderful example of co-management, knowledge co-production, cooperation among many, many, many different entities. And that's one of my favorite things about the system and something that makes it very easy to work in. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, the Nisqually Delta is really this complex mosaic of estuarine habitats, ranging from kind of freshwater tidal forested habitats through transitional scrub shrub habitats, high and low elevation emergent marsh, delta mudflats, and eelgrass beds, and then the nearshore and offshore intertidal zone. And juvenile salmon use all of these different habitats at different times during the outmigration period. Not only was there what we refer to as the major refuge restoration in 2009, which is that highlighted lobe on the west side of the river, but the Nisqually tribe carried out several phase restorations prior to that. So in 1996, they conducted what we call the pilot restoration. In 2002, they conducted a phase 1 restoration. And in 2006, they conducted a phase 2 restoration. And those 3 smaller restoration parcels are kind of in higher elevation marsh that was already vegetated. Whereas the lower elevation 2009 restoration, which we sometimes refer to as phase 3 in the refuge boundary, was much lower elevation, was more subsided. A little bit more historical context. So that refuge restoration area on the west side of the Nisqually River had been diked for agriculture since the early 1900s. And this is a historical photo of the construction of what we call the Brown Farm Dike. Over time, the area behind that dike became, as I mentioned, highly subsided and degraded. It was costing the refuge more money to maintain. It was overrun by reed canary grass and invasive species. So not only could salmon not access this habitat due to the dike, but now migratory waterfowl, which the refuge primarily manages for, could also hardly use this habitat. So this restoration, the hope was that it would benefit not only salmon, but migratory waterfowl, shorebirds, and other estuarine-dependent species. So in 2009, the dike was removed and the entire restoration area was restored to tidal influence. And here we have a picture of that first tide coming in. What happened was all the invasive reed canary grass and cattail and freshwater vegetation that was in this diked area was washed out to sea. And there's actually a story about how the Coast Guard had to be called in because in Puget Sound, there were these massive mats of vegetation floating and they were causing a shipping hazard. So that much vegetation got washed away. And what we were left with in 2010 and 2011 was kind of this subsided and degraded mudflat habitat. So completely unvegetated. And as you can see in the kind of panoramic photos and in this aerial imagery progression, is that over time, we started to see the recolonization of low elevation, saltwater tolerant marsh veg. And that transition has continued through time as well. But the restoration area certainly in its current trajectory is not returning to pristine conditions that we would expect to see, kind of that higher elevation bench marsh structure. What we're seeing is kind of a lower elevation patchy landscape, but still with incised tidal channels. And the main question here is, does this habitat still provide functional benefits for salmon? So we started out with the basic monitoring framework of just what's happening to this restoration area. And as you'll see in this kind of flow chart, we built over that framework through time. So starting out with monitoring efforts, We followed the success criteria of Simon said and Cordell, so opportunity, capacity, and realized function. So our opportunity is how much habitat is available. Foraging capacity is, are there sufficient prey resources there? And realized function is, are salmon using this habitat? And more specifically, are they accessing and benefiting from it in terms of, say, their growth potential and overall health? And to assess this, we collected a ton of data. So everything from elevation, tidal inundation, water temperature. For capacity, we collected prey resources, so aquatic, benthic, terrestrial prey. Realized function, we the tribe sampled fish and collected diet samples. And we assessed these data at 4 main sites. So 2 reference sites, the Nisqually reference and red salmon reference. And then phase 2 in Madrone, so phase 2 being that 2006 restoration area, and Madrone Slough being in the 2009 restoration area. And what we found was that indeed juvenile salmon were accessing and benefiting from this habitat. We saw highly abundant prey resources, and juvenile salmon growth rates were comparable to the reference sites. But of course, we wanted to contextualize this in the broader estuarine habitat mosaic. So we took it a step further, and with funding from Washington State, we sampled the full estuarine habitat mosaic from those freshwater tidal forested zones out into the kind of nearshore mudflat intertidal zone. And we collected prey resource data, fish habitat use data, and diet samples. And we also collected stable isotope data to get at longer term kind of prey resources. And from this information, we were able to build a detailed food web model for the entire delta. So really cool. I love this figure. But to summarize, what it shows is that the restoration area and the other emergent salt marsh habitats are actually subsidizing juvenile consumption throughout the entire delta. And that's happening not only because salmon are using this habitat and directly accessing those prey resources, but we also see indirect benefits where invertebrate species like shoreflies are foraging on the restoring marsh surface. And then, of course, they're flying off to other parts of the delta, falling into the water column, and salmon are eating them. So these subsidies are really important. We also, in related research, looking at the sediments, that research has shown that the estuarine marsh not only subsidizes the food web, but it also subsidizes the sediments that go into marsh accretion throughout the delta. So sediments from the restoration area are being redistributed throughout the delta and are depositing on the marsh surface. So those were 2 stable isotope-based projects with really cool findings. And an example of how we took our monitoring efforts a step further. Taking things even further. So we know what the restoration area is doing now and how it functions for salmon now, but how is it going to function in the future? Sea level rise is accelerating. We know that unless the marsh can keep pace with sea level rise, it's probably going to drown and lose a lot of vegetation. But we didn't have specific metrics for when this would happen and which parts of the delta were most sensitive to this climate change. So I'm not going to go into all the model equations, but basically what we were asking was, how much are sea levels going to rise in this system? Is there any room for lateral expansion, especially given, as I mentioned earlier, that boundary from the I-5 corridor? And then what's the adaptive capacity of the system to face climate change? So we ran a sea level rise marsh accretion model to predict elevation change and habitat distribution in the delta under different sea level rise and climate change and sediment management scenarios. And what we found that under worst case scenario sea level rise, the delta was expected to lose quite a bit of marsh habitat. And that restoration area, you can see on the right, that kind of blue lobe in the middle, that's the 2009 restoration area, was by far the most sensitive area to sea level rise. So we're losing marsh habitat, and we're losing that complex mosaic. We also ran water temperature models, and again, we found that climate change was expected to adversely affect the delta. Again, the restoration area being the most sensitive. So with 7 degrees Celsius increase in air temperature over the next 50 to 100 years, we expected to see a 10% increase in the amount of time that the habitat was untenable for juvenile salmon. And interestingly, sea level rise offset the effects of temperature, and this isn't surprising because with saltwater intrusion and with the tidal influence and deeper water, we would expect to see things cool down a little bit, but the offset really wasn't enough to maintain current temperature conditions for salmon. And then, of course, we fed all of this into a big bioenergetics model, which is a calories in, calories out equation for fish, because, of course, why not? And the message was still clear. So we saw the biggest decrease in growth rate potential for juvenile salmon in that restoration area. So overall, this restoration area is going to be highly sensitive to climate change without any sort of mitigating factors. And the mitigating factors that we found to be most influential was actually sediment increase. So just by doubling the amount of sediment that entered the system, the marsh was better able to keep pace with climate change, with sea level rise. And the reason this is highly relevant to Nisqually is that there is the Alder-LeGrand Dam complex on the Nisqually River. And this dam complex is estimated to capture about 90% of the sediment that comes off of Mount Rainier. So this is really a sediment-starved system, especially when you compare it to systems in the northern end of Puget Sound, like the Stillaguamish and especially the Skagit. The final step here in this hierarchy of monitoring and research in this restoring system was synthesizing this information and integrating it with broader Puget Sound and the Salish Sea. So we've done quite a few integrated analyses looking at diets from throughout Puget Sound, along with NOAA scientists. A big paper just came out talking about sediment, comparing Nisqually to the Snohomish River Delta, the Skagit, Stillaguamish, and Padilla Bay in terms of elevation change and sediment accretion. And we found that Nisqually was kind of in the middle in terms of its elevation change, but it's nowhere close to keeping pace to projected sea level rise. Whereas some of those sediment-rich systems like the Stillaguamish and Skagit are more resilient, are expected to be more resilient. And where we're going from here is we obtain funding from the Estuary and Salmon Restoration Program to, again, integrate this habitat restoration work and this monitoring work in a broader H-integrated framework. So how does this fit in with hatcheries, harvest, and hydropower? And to do this, we're conducting an integrated population model. And our hope is that this model will help promote efficient data use and collection efforts in Puget Sound and the Salish Sea. So our goal with this project is to produce a H-integration resource guide that's informed by the Nisqually Delta monitoring work and the integrated population model and broader lessons learned. So we hope to produce that in the next year or so. With that, I will again acknowledge all the funding agencies and cooperators that were vital for this project to take place. And I will open the floor to questions.
Melanie, thanks. That was fantastic. I appreciate you having good energy for us towards the end of a day of an online session. So we've got about 10 minutes where we can just do Q&A with you, and then we'll bring the other afternoon panelists back, and hopefully you can stay on for a panel with us to end the day. And I've got a few questions on my own list, but I'll start with what we've got on the Slido. The first one is, do you know how the co-management structure was developed? Oh, sorry, it just jumped around me. Where did it go? There it
Oh
is.
my gosh.
Amazing to see how many organizations committed to such a long-term project. We would benefit from such programs here in Canada, but haven't yet seen the appetite of governments, I'll say, and others to make such a long-term commitment.
I would say the base for that is that co-management is intrinsic to the way that the Billy Frank Jr. Nisqually National Wildlife Refuge has operated since its inception in, I believe, the 1970s. There is a tumultuous history behind that creation of that refuge a little bit, but really the tribe and the refuge have set forth to co-manage this land for the last few decades. I also want to recognize that the tribe has been an amazing team player, and I think they play an active role in facilitating a lot of these relationships. There's also a few great nonprofits. So the Nisqually Land Trust has been responsible for managing a lot of properties along the river in the freshwater habitat. And the Nisqually River Council has also played a role. So I don't know, just having a lot of folks at the table who are determined to co-manage, but also having that I guess regulatory framework to begin with. I cannot think of off the top of my head another example in the Salish Sea of a system that has been co-managed so effectively. And that's not to say there haven't been major challenges in the past and turnover and people who have not been interested in being team players over time. But for the most part, I'm always amazed at how well the system is co-managed. And as we're going through this H integration project that I've been talking about, I talked about at the end of my presentation. We recently held a workshop with federal, state, and tribal agencies in December, and we were trying to solicit information on what it would take to effectively conduct H-integrated salmon management in other systems. And it was this light bulb moment of, oh, wow, other systems don't do this as effectively as they do in Nisqually. And it's really, I mean, it's just, yeah, I can't say enough about how what a wonderful case study this is for effective data collection and data usage.
Yeah, I think it's these kinds of exchanges are helpful to show those examples, because I think many people are coming to grips with similar circumstances. There's lots of understanding of the background nature of the issues, but then how do you put it together to make something better happen? And that's where examples like what you're illustrating for us are helpful, I think, probably for lots of people in the audience.
Hopefully we'll have actually a tangible product soon. I'm working with a social scientist here at Oregon State University to use Nisqually as a case study for effective knowledge co-production with regards to integrated salmon management. So we're crossing, this paper is about to go out in the next few weeks, and we're crossing our fingers that it makes it through the peer review process smoothly.
Well, I think we'll look for that. Maybe we'll have you back and you and your collaborators can walk us through it. I'll keep pressing on to try to do best service to the questions we have. You mentioned sediment-starved areas and the significant risk of those places to sea level rise. Have you trialed different techniques for sediment nourishment in the estuary? Have some methods work better than others?
I wouldn't say we have actually carried out a process of trial and error. Eric Grossman with USGS, he's based out of Bellingham, has produced a USGS open file report in which he conducted some really detailed sediment modeling exercises So one idea to route sediment to the delta was to essentially create a channel, kind of a sediment bypass channel that directly routes sediment into some of the higher elevation areas adjacent to the river. And I believe what his model showed was that rerouting of sediment helps a little, but the problem at Nisqually is that there's just not that much sediment to begin with. So to effectively get sediment to the delta, we really need to find ways to get that sediment past the dams. And there's been some kind of, obviously we're working within the bounds of Tacoma Power and Tacoma's water usage needs, but there's been some discussion about altering kind of the dam drawdown strategies to encourage sediment to flow over the dam and make it downriver. But when you look at some of the LiDAR imagery of that delta above the Alder Lagoon Dam complex, that there's a document from, I believe, 2011, 2012 that was produced by the USGS Tacoma Water Science Center. It shows that all that sediment that should be in Puget Sound is trapped. It's its own delta in the mountains.
I'll do one more question with you before we bring the other panelists back for the afternoon panel. It's based on your results of how certain habitats subsidize salmon foraging opportunities. What restoration actions or considerations, I'll say, would you recommend to prioritize or have top of mind?
Oh, this is a tricky question for me as a federal scientist because I'm not supposed to make any sort of recommendations.
Well, you can
what I'll say,
imagine you're just talking to friends in Canada over a latte, and you can take your government duty hat off for a minute.
Yeah. I think so. One of the main takeaways was that even though this restoration area doesn't look pretty, it's in a lot of ways not, well, I would say in no way is it structurally equivalent to the historic salt marsh habitat that we expect to see over time, but it is still functioning for salmon. And so a take home, maybe this isn't a specific recommendation, but a take home that I would say is to drop your expectations about what is right when it comes to structural goals for restoration and focus on those functional benefits, especially if you're restoring for salmon. And that's those opportunity capacity realized function metrics. Are salmon using that habitat? So if you build it, will they come? Are there prey resources there? As I mentioned in my talk, we saw just tons of shore flies, and those shore flies were not only in the restoration area, they were flying to other part of the delta and being consumed by salmon. And we saw equivalent or greater growth rates in this restoration habitat. I would say functionally, the only thing that was less functional was that we saw slightly higher water temperatures, which of course has implications when you're dealing with climate change. When you're dealing with heat waves like we saw in 2015. But in that case, fish end up adapting anyway. And in that year, we saw fish kind of jetting out into the ocean directly, regardless of what conditions were in the restoration area. Another thought is that I've been working with some folks down here, Laura Brophy and Chris Janicek, on a proposal to focus on tidal swamp or tidal forested habitat restoration. That habitat type is largely overlooked in the Pacific Northwest, but it still has major functional benefits for salmon. So I'm really hoping that this proposal gets funded and we can conduct a full assessment of those habitat benefits, and it will also fund a few major tidal swamp restoration projects in the Pacific Northwest. So